IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Shambhavi Naik and I chair the Advanced Biology program at Takshashila. And along with me today, I have my colleague Saurabh. And today we're going to be discussing about critical technologies. So very recently, the European Commission recommended to its member states that they should all carry out risk assessment on critical technology areas for EU's economic security. In the past few months, we have seen different countries and groupings actually come up with their own critical technologies lists. The lists are somewhat similar. You have AI, quantum, biotech, etc. And today we're going to discuss the geopolitical significance of these lists and the implications of that for India, in particularly biotechnology, because Saurabh and I both like working on biotech. But before we get to biotech, Saurabh, what are critical technologies? Why are they critical?
I wish I knew because in a way that I think the definition is actually quite. We don't have a proper definition, right? Like the idea is that whatever a country feels that that technology is going to have a significant economic or security implications to itself and its population, it will be considered as it is a critical tech for that country, and that kind of risk assessment is being carried out by many countries and groupings. So I think the interesting part here is that how can we figure out what is critical, because I think even globally we have to have some semblance of a common kind of an understanding of what critical is, so that we can come up with some sort of a understanding on what types of restrictions do we want to apply on them, or what kind of cooperation. So that's what I feel, Shambhavi, that like a technology whose implications are far reaching to a country's security and economy is what I would think is as critical.
Yeah, it is quite interesting because there are also very umbrella terms that are used when they talk about critical technologies. For example, in biotech, they talk about synthetic biology, and that could literally be anything under the sun. I mean, I think scientists are still trying to figure out what is synthetic biology. For to put it on a list, by which you can then start looking at, oh, this technology could potentially be used for doing something bad without an appreciation of what good it can do, and the probability of doing bad and doing good. I think it's a little scary. Just the vague use of these terms, and I think it requires a bit more nuanced approaches. But tell me, why now? Why is all of this need for having this list coming in the past few months?
Yeah, I mean, if you see, I feel like, for example, you saw like the US kind of spearheaded this, like back in 2021, where like they did recognize that AI, quantum, biotech, semiconductors as elements or technologies which are very critical to its security. And I think steps that US has taken, for example, to ensure that its dominance stays, or at least it is able to build dominance, I think were like an example of a major country, a major economy, a major innovation powerhouse taking these steps. And then you see, I think with the COVID experience and then the fracturing geopolitics, I think the scope for cooperation has reduced significantly, which is quite sad. But this has also led countries to like kind of feel that, okay, I cannot rely on one or two countries, especially the ones who are like very big powers, to be solely dependent on them for these technologies. So just an example, like even for semiconductors, right? That like these chips are used in almost everything that we do. Our fridges, cars, keys, like now like home appliances and speakers, or I don't know, to like spacecrafts and everything. And there are very few countries that have the expertise to build these. And the fact that like the chance of failure, or like the diversification was so less, it kind of like became very apparent during COVID, when there was like supply chain disruptions. At the same time, China is like the main kind of component in many of the raw materials that go into these technologies. So I think the fracturing of like global geopolitics, I think, is leading to kind of countries being quite nervous about what what is their role, what is the role of technology, and how can they be at least somewhat not too dependent onto a few sources or a few technologies. So that's what I think is driving this.
Okay, let's talk about our favorite friend zone technology then, which is biotech, right? Biotech, we've often spoken that, hey, it is friend zoned because, in COVID, everyone was like, oh, we love biotech, mRNA vaccines. We even give the Nobel Prize for the underlying technology now. But the minute the crisis is gone, everyone's like, right, biotech is important, but we really don't know what to do with it, right? So we have seen a few initiatives. For example, US obviously has got that whole biomanufacturing initiative. But apart from that, nobody really knows what to do with biotech. The Quad obviously has biotech as one of its critical technologies. But again, what do we do underneath it? So what does putting biotech on a critical technologies list mean? Because semiconductors, I understand, there's a supply chain pathway, there are finite sources, etc. But biotech is like universal. CRISPR technology is now all over the world. How do you then regulate it?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you, and I think the way I feel is that I think countries realize that the power of biotech is substantial. The scope of what biotech can do, what like tools it has, CRISPR, gene editing, gene modification, gene drives, all of these. But countries are not sure what to do about it because, as you said, that semiconductors and all of that, they're quite like specific, right? Okay, you have to make chips. This is the supply chain. You have countries which will do designing of chips, fabrication, manufacturing. Then you have consumers, and also it's more structured and more regimented. But for biotech, because it is so broad, I mean, even biotech, I mean, we have been hearing the word biotech for decades now, and what all is included in biotech also changes substantially. So I would say that specifically for that purpose, I think countries are including it because they understand that this is a technology which has high potential, but we have not been able to figure out what exactly do we do with that. Because everything you do, from like just like GM crops to like gene therapies to stem cell therapy to medical interventions to creating new organisms, gene drives, I mean, the spectrum of what is possible is so large that you cannot possibly just regulate it all together at the same time. So I think it's just countries are confused. I think it will take some time to kind of figure out what actual aspect of biotech is worth regulating. And we have to make sure that obviously that when you regulate something, you do stifle innovation because you impose some sort of restrictions on it. So we have to ensure that in our kind of worry to kind of control the dual use nature of biotech, we don't end up limiting the real potential of this technology.
Which is very interesting because, I mean, the one lesson we learned through COVID was that, hey, the more we share, the more we work together, the better it is for the world to actually fight some of these bigger crises moments that we have, right? And I mean, just the way we quickly start making and exporting vaccines and diagnostics. I mean, even the gene sequence, right? The fact that it was so quickly made available, the virus sequence. And to go from there, to learn from there, and to try to address the fallouts of that, the whole geopolitical fracas that followed, with the idea that, hey, we can fragment now technologies. I think it's very interesting, and I think we need to do better, I think, as the world, right? That we have to also emphasize that when we talk about something as critical technology, when we talk about, it kind of almost conveys that, hey, we are going to be protectionist about this, but it doesn't need to be so, right? I think cooperation has to be the way forward. What do you think, Saurabh?
Yeah, but I think Shambhavi, I think the world or countries, like really like learned very different lessons from the COVID experience. So I think globally it was great that we were able to ramp up manufacturing so fast, right? Like the world was almost able to vaccinate in about 2 years, at least the major economies. At the same time, the level of cooperation that was witnessed, especially with scientists, in the global scientific community, to build these vaccines, to create these vaccines, to test them, and also it was great. But I think at the same time, you also saw the absolute dependence that the global community had on, let's say, China, or like one or two countries, for raw materials. Even India, for example, even though we had the, let's say, domestic vaccine, Bharat Biotech vaccine, but the adjuvants or other raw materials that we had to use for that vaccine came from abroad, and there was like some issue there as well, like, countries imposing restrictions on these technologies, or their export during the time of crisis. So I think a lot of this is also kind of due to the fear that countries don't want a repeat of that, where they are dependent on one or two suppliers. At the same time, you also had the concern of, there was a very significant difference between developed and developing world in terms of access to vaccines. Obviously, it is more complicated than that. But I think the countries were kind of like, they realized that, like, there are both pluses and minuses in this case. And I think the national security kind of side of states, I think they realize that they have to diversify their sources. At the same time, because geopolitics is now being fragmented, there is now blocks forming, and there is a, like, kind of rise of middle powers who are now asserting their independence in terms of standards, in terms of, having a voice in regulation. I think this need is only increasing.
Okay, and I think it's very interesting because I get your point. I think there is a part of it which is innovation. There's part of it which is scaling up, and I think that as the world, we obviously have to increase capacity. I don't think we have still reached too many countries with the COVID vaccine, and I think it was partly a problem of both. Right, it was a problem of us not sharing enough, and the same protectionist policies that eventually came up because we were in a crisis and weren't prepared for it. Um, and preparation for the crisis, I think, has to be the first thing, the first priority of all countries. Some of the more bigger problems, say climate change, for example, synthetic biology could actually play a stellar role if used properly. And this again brings me back to the point of putting it on a list, because that just conveys a lot more than what the countries might actually end up doing. And I think the EU and the US have traditionally had very diverse, rather very opposite kind of risk assessment approaches. Right, the EU, at least from the biotech perspective, has been traditionally very risk averse. It seems to have very recently now tried to temper that view. We saw very recently that there was a suggestion given that genetically edited crops be allowed within the EU, and that's something for the EU states to consider. But yeah, I think if we get to very diametrically opposite risk assessments for similar technologies, that is also going to be fascinating to go ahead, Saurabh.
Yeah, I would say that, for example, I think for what you said regarding being at least ready or aware of, what the risks are, I think that is what is happening right now, where countries are like, okay, I think it was a very unexpected shock during COVID, right? So I think the countries right now, let's say US, EU, even India in its own way, and also China, for example, they are trying to figure out that in these very frontier technologies, which are very important and essential for their security and economy and their status as a developed countries, what are the risk factors? Are they too dependent on a source? Is that source a friend or an ally? And I think that is just a part and parcel of, this kind of realignment that's happening. So I think that kind of world is getting ready to kind of see what all to have a better idea of what is the landscape right now, in terms of, like, which are the pressure points that a country has for its security and economy with respect to critical technologies. At the same time, I don't think that like we would not have cooperation. I think, for example, as you said, rightly so, that synthetic biology can play a significant role in climate change. But then the issue here would be that which are the countries which will have the technology or the IP to create, let's say, an organism or tools from biotech and synthetic biology that would be then used to kind of address climate change, let's say to build a GM bacteria that can sequester carbon, or to produce like a strain or species of plants which can can capture more carbon from the environment. So the tools will be helpful globally. Countries all over the world will be able to use those products made from these tools. But which are the countries which will have those technologies? And then, for example, let's say China has a technology where they are being able to produce a functional GM bacteria or algae, let's say, which can sequester carbon. Would India want to use that? Would India want to have its own technology? Would US be okay with it, right? Or should US, EU, and India work together on this? So I think those are, where the issues will crop up of mainly security, where the technology is out there, but application is that how do you get an edge over your adversary is, I think, the main kind of a point of contention going forward.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
I think there are 2 or 3 things that come out of it, right? So there's economic security. So securing our own supply chain for something that is existing and that might be required or is currently required, right? Second is innovation. And can we derive IP and strengthen our own economic interests going forward? I mean, whichever country makes that GM bacteria for sequestering carbon is going to hit a jackpot. So that's the second. And third, I think it was part of the EU circular as well, that they want to guard against theft of technical know-how of some of these technologies. And I think we have to have a bit more understanding of what that means. And again, that cannot be at a technology level. That can be at an application level, and that makes sense. I think one of the philosophies we always have at Takshashila is that regulation should be at application level, not at a tech level, because once you bucket the technology as good or bad, it becomes good or bad. And that's not true. It has to be at the application level. So going forward, I think it's going to be interesting. Does India have a critical tech list, Saurabh?
I don't think so. We have. I mean, at least from if I recall correctly, I think there have been discussions on in both in the government and also outside, right? Like people in think tanks and all. Okay, what is more critical? How do we handle it? But I think at a national level or at a government-wide level, we have not had like that kind of risk assessment. Which, let's say, the EU has started like a few days ago, or at least the grand document that which the US also has. So I guess that's one thing that we should kind of push for, or at least see that that happens, because I mean, honestly, we need a whole of government approach in this. Because if you see, even with regulation and what is critical and what is risky and what not, the Ministry of Science and Tech or the Department of Biotech will have a very different opinion on what are the issues or avenues or promises or drawbacks of a technology that, let's say, the Ministry of Environment can, or maybe the Ministry of Commerce, because then they have to now worry about, well, you have a great technology, but are you able to commercialize it? So things like that. So I think we need a whole of government approach where almost all major organs of the government, all ministries, security, health, environment, science and tech, education, all of them come together and do a comprehensive risk assessment on what are the critical techs that India needs, should have, and what is the roadmap. So I think that's very sorely needed.
Yeah, I think what I found very interesting was a few weeks ago we had a deep tech startup policy that was open for consultation from the Principal Scientific Advisor's Office, and they had a classification in one of the annexes on various deep tech startups, and there was no biotech startups in there. And I don't know whether that is just an outcome of the lack of classification within DPP IT, or how that has happened. But anyways, there was no biotech startups. And I think one of the things that having a critical technologies list does is gives you an opportunity to always think about those technologies when you're creating policies. And that is going to be really, really critical going ahead.
Yeah, and I think at the same time, if you see these new steps, for example, even this, so now we finally have a national research foundation. So I think this kind of provides also an opportunity, right? Where now if we figure out, or if we kind of decide that, okay, these are the areas where, India is vulnerable or we need more research, then you can also kind of divert or at least channel funding in a more effective manner, right? You will not just do it on the basis of, you have a person from a specific field who is now heading the ministry, or is the secretary, or is the minister in power, who will then just say, okay, this idea is good or this area is good. So having a kind of a more comprehensive risk assessment might actually help to better kind of spend the money that we are spending. It obviously needs to increase as well, but I think we can channelize our expenditure a lot better.
I agree, and to also bring on board a lot of departments that otherwise are in silos, because it will require input from, say, the MEA. It will require input from the Ministry of Science and Tech, like you spoke about, trade, and so I think it would be a really good exercise to be done. So, Saurabh, you have marked yourself another project in the coming weeks, have you?
I guess so. I think, but it is, and for sure, something I think that is worth looking into. And even when we say, it needs a whole of government approach, I think in India, because we don't have a history of that, what exactly that means is also yet to be seen. I think we would find that people will be confused that why do you need, let's say, MEA or Ministry of Commerce or DST, DBT, all in the same place. But in a very, kind of a encouraging sign, I think. So, MEA, I think about 2 years ago, created like this NEXT division, NEST division, so new emerging and strategic technology kind of division within the MEA. So at least there was this kind of realization that as part of our diplomacy, we need to ensure that we put front and center these new and emerging technologies, and in our discussions, we do include them. At the same time, I think we are now, doing all these FTAs, right? So we had one with the UAE, one with Australia, the one with UK is expected to be kind of signed soon, hopefully by the end of this year. We have active negotiations with the EU as well. So I think even during those discussions, right, if we know which areas or sectors are critical and the ones that we have comparative advantage, or the ones we actually do need to promote, so in these discussions we would be a lot more prepared, and we will be careful not to kind of give away the access, or at least demand more in exchange of access to market or people for these technologies, right, from abroad, if we know what are we asking or what is our risk profile.
Yeah, agreed. I think a risk assessment is and an identification of the critical technologies is important, and should be done. And hopefully, it would be a whole of government approach, not a silo, because that is not going to really help. And again, what are going to be the parameters on which we do the risk assessment, economic security, biosecurity, etc. That is going to be critical, and making the correct trade-off between cooperation and restriction to ensure that India can best use the technologies that are coming through for applications that are most relevant for us. I think is going to be critical. Is there anything else, Saurabh?
No, I think the fact that EU is doing this is also remarkable because they usually, I think the fact that EU is doing this following the US and many other countries shows that this is something that is going to take a lot of time of diplomats, scientists, even policymakers in the coming weeks and months, and I think we should be prepared for this. So I hope that somebody in the government is listening to our podcast. I know they do listen, so I think this is something that I think we should do, and I hope that we do come out with at least a broad document saying that this is our risks, this is what our opportunities are, and these are the technologies which we need to focus on.
Right. Cool. Thank you so much, Saurabh. And thank you all for listening. If the next time you hear critical technologies, please think of Saurabh, and please think that we still need to come up with a list. Thank you for listening. Thanks, Saurabh.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app. ivmpodcast.com or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVMPodcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.